Across the country, many young people are experiencing an economic crisis.
The rental market is absolutely shocking. I mean, it was very difficult to find a place.
The concept of setting myself up, which maybe previous generations have been able to do in their late 20s and early 30s, feels unattainable for me right now.
Jack Simmons works part-time for a climate change advocacy group and lives in a share house. The 28-year-old will benefit from the $300 energy bill rebate and the revised Stage 3 tax cut, but he's frustrated that high-income earners will also get the same benefits.
And in a time where wealth inequality is rampant, that to me feels very irresponsible.
Other measures like pay for student placements, extra rent assistance and $3 billion worth of student debt reduction were also included in the budget. But it's too little too late for 24-year-old teaching graduate Franco De Gioia.
To be quite honest, seeing that the budget was supporting practicum students, I wish that it was me.
Late last year, he was living without an income for 12 weeks because of an unpaid work placement. He says he had to take a personal loan of $3,000 to survive.
I felt it was the only option, so it felt incredibly bad, and I'm still feeling the effects of it 6 months later.
Many young Australians view the government's cost of living help as piecemeal and inadequate. They say these quick fix measures won't make their lives easier in the long run, and they'd rather see bold reforms.
Labor is only tinkering around the edges. They're not getting to the heart of the structural issues.
There's definitely a little bit in this budget for young people, but nothing that really starts to tackle the intergenerational inequality that we're starting to see grow in Australia.
New research from the Productivity Commission confirms the growing wealth inequality between young and older Australians. Rising property values are driving that divide.
Higher interest rates are going to be very hard for people who are still paying off a mortgage or who are trying to buy a property, but they're not really a factor for someone that has already paid off their property.
For those who don't already own a home, the time taken to save a deposit has jumped by 2 years over the past decade.
That is assuming a 15% savings rate every year. At the moment, the household savings rate is more like 3%, and people are dealing with a higher cost of living, and if they're in the rental market, higher rental costs.
That's resulted in declining home ownership, from around 70% in the 1980s, 90s and early 2000s to 67% in the most recent census. The fall has been driven mainly by younger age groups, with ownership rates among people in their early 30s plunging from more than 2/3 at the start of the 1980s to just 50% now.
The Australian dream of owning a home is basically dead unless you've got wealthy parents.
So how can we fix this?
If we expand the supply of housing, it will become more affordable and accessible to everybody. But what we see, this has been a big debate in Sydney, for example, is we see a lot of NIMBYism. Lots of councils don't want an expansion of housing in their area.
But Eliza Owen says tax breaks that pump up demand for housing should also be on the table.
It's been decades of policy failure that's gotten us to this point. So it's probably worth looking to some more bold reform around housing demand.
For now, the great Australian dream remains out of reach for a growing number of young Australians.
It does make it especially hard in this time to be a young person trying to get established, trying to set up a career, trying to save for a home deposit.
I hope to see a more, positive and equitable Australia, and one wherein I can say to my students that there's a lot of opportunity out there and the world is full of opportunity. But at the moment, that's not something I can quite say.
Ross Garnaut is one of Australia's most respected economists, having held senior roles in government and business. The Emeritus Professor at Melbourne University joined me earlier to delve further into the specific challenges facing Australia's younger generations. Welcome to The Business. Are young Australians justified in feeling as though the economy is stacked against them?
Oh, I think so, especially when you compare their situation with young Australians when I was their age. Much harder to get housing compared with the days of full employment, which I grew up in. Harder to get a job, and especially if people don't have high qualifications. So life is harder than it used to be, and we've got to work towards making it better again.
There is an ambitious push to increase housing supply and ease pressures on affordability. When do you see supply catching demand?
Unfortunately, we're a long way behind, and we have been getting behind for a fair while. There are problems in the tax system which have made it harder for people to own their own homes because they've made it easier for people to invest in other people's homes. And we've got supply problems in a lot of our councils. That's at a state level, not at a Commonwealth budget level. And high interest rates have slowed down housing investment in the last year or so. So getting interest rates down so that we can get back to old levels of housing investment is very important. And then immigration is high. And in combination with those factors affecting supply makes things very tight. Current policy is due to reduce rates of immigration, so things will head in the right direction. The question is whether they'll head fast enough.
Does immigration need to stay low, or will Australia need to revisit that question in the interests of the nation's economic growth?
Oh, I think the downward adjustment in the government's program that's currently been announced should stay. We just went too high after the pandemic. During the pandemic recession, there was no immigration at all. And then the gates were open and it rose to a very high level. We're getting back towards a normal level. We at least have to get back to that normal level. And we have to make sure that we're not having too many unskilled people. It's the skilled part of the program that really adds to the Australian economy. The unskilled part increases competition for those young people who are not well established in the labour market.
The opposition leader says he'd stop foreigners from buying existing homes. Is that a measure that should be implemented now?
I don't think he's looked at how many foreigners are actually buying homes. That's a very small part of the story, so it can only be a very small part of any solution.
Is the housing crisis influencing the way younger people are approaching the jobs market and university?
I don't know about that general question, but certainly affecting their attitude to life. My exposure to young people these days is through my teenage grandchildren, and it's quite clear that in this generation kids can't go into life in the same expectation of owning their home as before. I think that's a big pity for Australian society. We have to fix it up.
And so do most millennials' hopes for home ownership now rest on the transfer of intergenerational wealth?
Well, it can't, because not all kids have wealthy parents who are able to hand over those sorts of assets. We've given up on equity if we see that as the main mechanism.
What key measures would make the system fairer?
First, return to full employment. We were closer to it for a while. Unemployment's drifting up again now. That has a disproportionate effect on young people. We need real jobs that allow people to feel secure in taking on a housing loan. That's number one. As we do that, we can bring interest rates down. I think they've gone unnecessarily high. That's reflected in the very weak labour market recently. Some people are saying they should go higher because of inflation. Those people, economists or not, are not looking at what's actually happening in the labour market and to inflation. And we've got to make it easier for builders to build houses. That's a planning question. All of these things together are part of the solution.
On energy, are the government's production tax credits for hydrogen and critical minerals critical themselves to Australia reaching net zero by 2050?
the best thing in the budget for young people is that it does quite a lot about climate change, and the people who will be damaged by climate change, the people whose lives will be greatly disrupted if we don't deal with climate change, are today's young people. I'll be dead and won't see it. My grandchildren will live through it. So we've got to deal with that problem. Those measures in the budget go a long way to allowing Australia to help the world get to low carbon emissions, allow the world to get to net zero. They will help us be a big exporter of green iron, a lot of industries that use renewable energy and biomass. That will make it possible for Europe and Northeast Asia to get to net zero when otherwise they wouldn't. So we can help the world get to net zero. That's the biggest single thing we can do for young people, not only by stopping climate change, but that is secure good jobs well into the future for another couple of generations of Australians.
A CSIRO report out today estimates nuclear power would cost at least 50% more than wind and solar backed by batteries. Should that end the debate over nuclear power in Australia?
Well, I don't mind a debate. I'm not against nuclear, and in my first climate change review for all of the state premiers and the Prime Minister back in 2008, I saw a role for nuclear by the 2030s. But things have changed. Now, renewable energy backed up by storage is the cheap way to get zero emissions. Nuclear is much more expensive, will also take much longer. It'll be too late to contribute very much. No problem in people discussing it. Maybe someone will invent some form of nuclear that's better, but from what we know now, it's not going to be a significant part of the story.
Professor Ross Garnaut, terrific to speak to you.
Thanks, Kristen.